Oh, so thank you and welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining and thanks for your interest in this webinar. I'm also very much looking forward to it. Just wanted to introduce a couple of my colleagues that are going to be speaking today. So Suzanne Rumsey, Public Engagement Coordinator, is going to be kind of sharing some prayers and also helping to moderate the Q&A sessions. And my colleague, Jackie Koster, is our Director of Programs and Partnerships. Hope I got that in the right order. I was about to say our new director, but I think she's been around long enough now that she may not be new to us, but she's probably new to you. And so she has a lot to share about sort of the context we're in. And Suzanne, I think you're going to do a more detailed intro, but just want to let you know if you can remain on mute unless you're actually one of the people speaking. And we will do a couple of Q&A times in between parts of the presentation. So Jackie's going to be doing 3 kind of components to the presentation with a couple of points for questions of clarifications, and then we will have a more lengthy Q&A time at the end of the session. And just also a reminder that we are scheduled to go to 2:30, so it's scheduled for 90 minutes. And so we will certainly be having time for Q&A. And this is being recorded, so I'll be sharing it with folks as well to pass around to your networks after the fact. So with that, I will stop speaking and introduce Suzanne Rumsey again.
Thanks, Kim, and welcome to everyone. It's good to see you all. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. And because PWRDF is located within the Diocese of Toronto, I went to their website and found a very fine land acknowledgement that has been shaped into a helpful PowerPoint with maps. And people who know me know I like maps. So we'll begin with that, and I'll just share my screen to offer the land acknowledgement. As we gather, we acknowledge that the area we know as the Diocese of Toronto is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. This land is also the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care peaceably for the resources around the Great Lakes. We give thanks for the stewardship of this land by Indigenous people and the continuing presence here of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge the displacement of First Nations people to reserves by a series of treaties, the harm caused by colonialism, and the role our church has played in it. We acknowledge that we have failed to live up to the treaties, and we commit ourselves to seeking a new and honorable relationship with the First Peoples of this land. And then I'd like to offer an opening prayer. Those of you who have joined us over time at Praying with PWRDF will know this prayer. And if you remember it, please pray it along with me. And it was a prayer that was created by the community that gathers at Praying with PWRDF. So let us pray. God of hope, in an ever more connected world, you call us together in acts of caring, and you call us to uphold the dignity of every human being by transforming structures that deny that dignity. Child of peace, you invite us into friendship with you, you who are present in the vulnerable and marginalized communities in Canada and throughout the world. You challenge us to recommit and rededicate ourselves to ensuring their agency and to making the whole world safe. Spirit of love, you speak to us through the smiling faces of our partners whose generosity of reflective, focused, and mindful caring calls forth our own generosity as we share food, share health, share our lives. God, child, spirit, in this uncertain time, hold us, the people and partners of PWRDF, in your loving embrace, and walk with us as we continue on the journey towards a truly just, healthy, and peaceful world. Amen. Finally, before I stop speaking, I want to introduce our colleague, Jackie Koster. Jackie joined PWRDF in December of 2023 as the Director of Programs and Partnerships. She began her career working with the International Organization for Migration, and prior to joining PWRDF was for 16 years staff at World Renew, the Relief and Development Agency of the Christian Reformed Church of Canada. There she gained extensive experience in programming humanitarian relief initiatives all over the world, in particularly as they relate to climate change. Born in Australia, Jackie grew up in Indonesia and Richmond, British Columbia, and now makes her home in Hamilton, Ontario, where she joins us from today. Welcome, Jackie, and I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, nice to see many faces on the screen, and actually to hear someone reference UBC earlier, which is where I did my undergraduate. So it's always nice to hear the cross-reference of Canadian locations. And indeed, I'm coming from Hamilton, Ontario today. And yeah, coming up on 6 months with PWRDF, and glad to have a few colleagues on the call today. So as we go through this presentation, there'll be time for question and answer throughout. Feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, and then pause. We can certainly take questions both from the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, or just take yourself off mute. And I see a few of my P&P colleagues as well. You may be able to give some more in-depth answers about specific projects if you're curious. But let me share my screen. So you can all see that relatively clearly. And I was joking with someone, I feel like this is a little bit of doing a book report. You know, what have I learned after 5 and a bit months with PWRDF? And I've learned a bit, but I'm sure there's a lot more learning I have ahead. So what I wanted to share today is sort of 3 components. So I want to sort of share a little bit of first impressions. What are some of the things that coming out of a peer organization like World Renew, doing somewhat similar work, but in different contexts and in different ways? What have been my first impressions of the work of PWRDF? What really stands out as quite unique programming in this work? Then we'll pause, any questions on that. Then I want to talk a little bit about the context that we find ourselves in these days. You know, it's a very complex time. You just have to look at the headline news on any given day to see the intersectionality of different issues. And that really has shaping our strategic plan, which in turn is shaping the programming and what some of the priorities are going to be ahead. And that segues into what are some of the things that we're talking about in programs and partnerships around our strategic plan and the way forward in the coming years. So that's a little bit of the roadmap. I'm not planning to take the full 90 minutes, so do feel free to have plenty of questions as we go along, and I'm hoping there could be time for discussion. So when I sort of dive into the first impressions, I think it's helpful to just do a little reminder of the context of our work in terms of what are our priorities. And so you'll hear me reference the SDGs throughout this presentation, the Sustainable Development Goals that were created by the United Nations, with the goal of achieving them by 2030. And within those broad SDGs, we really have a focus on 6 sort of thematic areas, looking at food security and climate change, migration, empowering women, preventive health, humanitarian relief and disaster response, accompanying refugees and Indigenous communities. So sort of a broad spectrum of programming themes. A lot of them, you'll see all 6 themes in one program or working with one partner or in one country. So a lot of overlap, but to give some focus to sort of the context of the projects. In the last year, we worked in 32 countries, all through partners, and just under $4 million in programming funds were dispersed, which is a little bit of a tricky number to collate each year, because sometimes the funding was dispersed in the last year, but was used in this fiscal year. So don't read too much into that, but I think an important sort of scale. So 32 countries and 4 million in programming. So I want to talk about three sort of programs in particular that I think highlight the unique work of PWRDF. And the first is a program called Nature Plus, which I think really highlights the way that we're engaging in climate change in new and different ways. And it also highlights the way we work alongside local partners. So Nature Plus is a program through the Canadian Food Grains Bank with funding from Global Affairs Canada. And we're working with a partner called Suro in Zimbabwe. And I had the privilege of traveling there in February of this year. And this is a picture from Chimanimani, where their office is located. An incredibly beautiful place. And, I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I could put a lot of words on a PowerPoint, or I could just give you a picture of a place that is incredibly unique. It is one of the unique biospheres in the world. It's an area that straddles the border between Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and the ecosystem contains plant species and birds that are found nowhere else in the world. So really a unique place. But because of the pressures of climate change, it is a place that is under increasing stress. So in 2019, we responded in this area with Suro in response to a cyclone, Cyclone Idai. And you can see on the hills there's quite deep gullies. And a lot of these gullies were really deepened by the storm and exposed minerals and opportunities for artisanal or illegal mining activities to start happening as people look for livelihoods. And that released a lot of arsenic into the waterways, and the damage that resulted into communities, to people's health, but also to the nature in this area. There's been a lot of migration within Zimbabwe, a lot of economic pressures with people returning to their historic areas. And farming has taken off in this area, but in hilly landscape, farming often leads to erosion. So a lot of interesting challenges that we're seeing here. And so when the opportunity came along to work in conjunction with the Canadian Food Grains Bank as part of a broader consortium, we were really thrilled to be able to join and learn from other organizations, including one just across the border in Mozambique. And so working with Suro, it's a really integrated approach, very holistic, looking at how to build up from a grassroots level. So a lot of community mobilizing and looking at intersectional issues. This was a meeting of a peace committee that was looking at grazing rights and how do we use land. There's a lot of cattle in the lowlands, and that cattle, how do we migrate them around areas so that there's time for the rangeland to be rehabilitated in between grazing seasons. There's also a lot of challenges around water usage. And so a lot of the work of the peace committee is how do we sustainably manage water? How do we fairly and equitably get access to water? And one big component of this project is actually looking at irrigation. And so how do we work with communities and committees to make sure that voices are heard as decisions are being made around water? There's also a lot of focus in this program around improving agricultural practices. And Suro, as an organization, actually grew out of a farming cooperative. And still, that's very much at the heart of their organization, is a farming cooperative. Again, looking at reforestation, erosion prevention, how do we work within this hilly landscape in a way that is in harmony with the nature that is there? And, in many of the programs of PWRDF, you see the intersectionality of gender-based issues. And in this case, looking at gender-based violence prevention, how do we talk about these issues? How do we sort of give voice as we look at communities mobilizing? How do they do that in a good way? So a lot of really interesting things happening there. We're coming to the end of the first year of this program, a couple of years ahead. So it's going to be really exciting to be able to share some of the results. And I think for me, this is a program that really epitomizes the way of working with local organizations within PWRDF. And before I move on to another program, I did just want to sort of give a face to this project. And this is a woman I met in a small community called Zandoni. Her name was Mercy. And it was really interesting in talking with her and her reflection on how this area has changed in the time that she's lived there. So she's not originally from the Chimanimani area. She moved there when she got married. And it's a very different area than she grew up in Zimbabwe. And so in this area, it's more common to grow what are called small grains, so millet and sorghum. as opposed to maize, which she was more familiar with. And so she was talking about how when she moved to this area almost 30 years earlier, it was sort of coming into a group of women, one of the Suro groups that was looking at climate issues already in the early 2000s, that really helped her in thinking about adapting what she was growing, adapting the ways she was cooking and preparing food. And she was a very humorous woman and talking about how she's really developed an appreciation for small grains, which she never thought she would. And when I asked her, well, what's her hope now with this program that's there? And it was actually, how do you build this up into a business? How do we, as a women's collective, get some machinery through village savings and loans that they have, so that they can actually make some value addition to the small grains that they're growing and sell them on a local market? So really interesting to see sort of the growth and the adaptation that she had experienced. But she also reflected on those impacts of climate change and what that's meant in terms of access to market. Roads had been washed out during the cyclone, and so harder to get to places like a clinic and schools. And so also she was hoping that that broader advocacy piece around climate change, and I was reflecting on how in Canada, we have an obligation as well to advocate for a reduction in emissions and other causes of climate change. And this partnership that we have, not only with the adaptations that are happening in places like Zimbabwe as a result of climate change, but what we can be doing as PWRDF here in Canada. So that is Mercy. A second program that really has struck me as very unique, and one that I'm still feeling like I'm in the very early days of learning, but I think it's our Indigenous midwifery work. And for me, this work, having read through the different reports and hear some of the stories about it, I think really epitomizes an approach within PWRDF of creating and holding space. That it's not us coming in as experts, it's not us coming in with solutions, but it's us being blessed with resources from people here in Canada to be able to create spaces for people to learn, to people to gather, for people to build relationships. And to see this program, which has been ongoing for a number of years now, it's in the second phase of work, and how that has built up relationships over time between people in different countries who are experiencing exclusion from healthcare systems that don't necessarily bring in Indigenous midwifery to the traditional healthcare systems that are there. And so through this program, we've been able to create linkages between different countries. At the moment, there's a focus on Mexico and Peru, and having exchange visits where midwives can visit each other. They can arrange workshops that are sort of guided and led by what is it they want to learn, what is it that they want to share, and how can this initiative be scaled up to a regional level. And so I've seen in the work of PWRDF this similar approach taken around different issues. So in Brazil at the moment, we're in conversation around how can a similar approach of building up relationships, building up conversations, exchanges, and spaces be brought about Indigenous communities and climate change, both here in Canada, but also in Brazil. And so to me, I think this really has stood out for me as a very unique approach of PWRDF to sort of humbly hold that space and not sort of be charging in with solutions or remedies, but instead using the resources that we have to create spaces for people to come up with solutions and ways of working, but more importantly, find solidarity with other people who are experiencing both similar challenges, but also finding unique solutions. So that's the sort of second of the three projects I wanted to share a little bit about. And the third one, I think, really speaks to PWRDF's leadership role in a number of the ecumenical networks that we're a part of. And so this is the Locally Led Climate Fund, which is an initiative that PWRDF really stepped up to in 2020 through ACT Alliance. And ACT Alliance is one of the key networks for us on a global level. It is the World Council of Churches Relief and Development Agency that brings together churches from across the world and their relief and development agencies, and working at national level through what are called forums. The goal is to also build up relationships, build up connections, but respond at scale to issues that are happening around the world. And so through ACT Alliance and through the Canadian Forum, it was PWRDF that really stepped up in 2020 to say, what more can we do? Here we are in Canada, a group of Canadian organizations we're part of this global network, and we want to be making meaningful impact. But a little bit like the approach with the Indigenous Midwifery Project, how do we actually engage in conversation and listening and learning before coming up with a program? And so really an extended process from 2020 to 2022 of listening to our partners and our colleagues in East Africa, in Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda, really asking this question of what can we do together as fellow ACT members around the world to support and respond to the climate emergency. And so the outcome of that 2-year process was to bring forward an initiative that is supporting climate justice initiatives in East and Southern Africa. And so a decision was taken in the Canadian Forum that it was really going to be an initiative where the Canadian organizations pull together a fund, but then step back and let decision-making and ideas come from the national forums in East and Southern Africa. PWRDF, again, I think in really a testament to the leadership that we took in this initiative, put forward an initial 100,000 in seed money, which then grew with contributions from other Canadian organizations to $270,000 in the first year. In Canada, just to name off the organizations there, in case you're curious who are the ACT members in Canada, so the Lutheran Church, Presbyterians, ourselves, the United Church, World Renew, and the World Association of Christian Communicators. So that's the group here in Canada that put together the initial 270,000. But being a global network, we benefit from a lot of support also from the ACT Alliance Regional Office in East Africa. And then a steering committee was put together for this initiative so that the voices of both the organizations participating and implementing projects, but also us here in Canada, could find a forum to continue conversations to help shape and guide the work that's happening. 4 projects were funded in the first year in Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Uganda. And very early days still, but some really interesting results around building up climate justice champions, environmental committees that have been formed, this overall increase in awareness and collaboration that has led to some really interesting policy dialogues and conversations around natural resource management. And amidst this as well, looking at livelihoods being strengthened. In one case, I think it was chicken rearing that was happening. So diverse, but really interesting to see how here in Canada during the pandemic, when everything was online, these conversations could lead to really practical ways of mobilizing and coordinating in East Africa and Southern Africa to bring about conversations and changes in various policies at government level. So we are looking and continuing to lead this initiative and looking to go beyond just the Canadian Forum. So we've already had some additional pledges for year 2 of the project from some US members of ACT Alliance, but also interest from New Zealand members of ACT Alliance. So to me, this is a project that really speaks to the leadership that PWRDF gives in the various networks and alliances that we're part of. I'm going to pause there for any questions, and have seen a thing pop up, but Suzanne, I'll hand it to you for any questions.
So this is from Marion in Ottawa. What is your impression comparing PWRDF to what you were doing at World Renew?
That's a good question. I think, to me, it's been an exciting transition from at World Renew. My focus was very much within the humanitarian sphere. So to me, it's not that World Renew doesn't do the long-term development work. It just wasn't my area of focus at World Renew. And so certainly for me coming to PWRDF, that's the piece that really has left a strong impression. Yes, there's the strong humanitarian work, and I think I saw Naba on this call as well, and the work that he's doing in various places. But to me, the strongest impression in the first 5 months has been, really excited to learn the ways of PWRDF's long-term development work. So there are similarities. I think many of the organizations that are affiliated with churches, we work in a lot of the same networks and alliance. So for example, World Renew is also a member of ACT. So I think that has been a little bit helpful in these first 5 months to have those points of familiarity too, and some existing relationships within those networks.
Thanks. Sandra asks, has this approach to programming changed as issues have become more complex?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think, Sandra, if it's okay, I'll probably answer a bit of that question in the next few slides as well, how it's changed and what some of the dynamics behind those changes are. But definitely, yeah, I think as issues have become more complex, or perhaps maybe as we become more aware of the complexity in this work, is more of an intentional effort to look at holistic programming through sort of the intersectional lens, that don't assume if you're just working on agriculture that that doesn't impact on gender, or if you're working on gender that doesn't impact on health programming. And I think, yeah, we have an increased awareness of, of of the way the complexity leads to a need for intersectional programming.
And I think we're finding that reflected, Jackie, in our public engagement work too. So when we talk about climate change, it's not climate change on its own, but climate change in gender, climate change in food security, those intersections, as you say. And Sandra just added, is the kind of programming we're doing different from what it might have been done in the past? So I think you'll address that in the next section. Yeah.
Good.
I think we can move on, Jackie.
Great.
Thanks.
So I wanted to then move into talking about these complex contexts that we find ourselves in. And I think thinking about those contexts in a number of ways. And in my work at World Renew, my focus was very much on food insecurity. And so that tends to still be a lens that I look through a lot of this work through. And I find quite interesting to continue to monitor and watch. And there's some fantastic reports that are issued every year. If this is something that's of interest to you, there's the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Programme, and they contribute to a global hunger report each year. And in that report each year, they sort of track what are the current statistics around hunger and how it's being experienced around the world. Now, I'm not a statistician by any means, and so definitions are really important when we talk about numbers. And so when we're talking about numbers here, we're looking at undernourishment. So that top gray line that you see there is the number of people who are undernourished in the world. And there are quite clear and precise definitions around that, and those have been consistent throughout the time frame on this chart. The orange line that you see at the bottom is the percentage, the prevalence of undernourishment globally. So top line is a raw number and orange line is a percentage. I started in this work in 2008, and it was really an encouraging time in terms of seeing declines in global food insecurity, seeing some real gains being made in various areas around the world. And that's changed in the last few years. You can sort of see that incline that's really begun pre-COVID, so 2014, starting to creep up. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But I think it is significant. It's not just because the global population is increasing, even though that does contribute a little bit to it. You can see in 2005, the percentage of prevalence was 12%, and in 2022, just under 10%. So overall, the percentage is not back to the levels of 2005, but in terms of a raw number, we're within 10 million of the number that was seen in 2005. So I think it's really a call to action for organizations that do engage in food security work. And again, I think thinking through that complexity, because when we look at where food insecurity is being experienced, and I've included the website there, which is a bit long to jot down, but that's the Food Security Report. And this is actually, I couldn't get it to work in the PowerPoint slide, but a fantastic graph that shows change over time. And so you can see these countries sort of moving up and down. Some new countries emerge over that 2017 to 2023 timeframe. But when we look in 2023, 63% of the population of South Sudan were facing high levels of food insecurity. And when we talk about high levels of food insecurity, that's the point where humanitarian intervention is needed in order to save livelihoods or lives. So it's significant. It's not, certainly not a low threshold. High levels of acute food insecurity is sort of the tipping point for humanitarian intervention. So in terms of PWRDF's programming, quite a number of these countries you'll see featured in our annual report on our website, through our networks and through our partners. Substantial programming for us in the last year in South Sudan, looking at how do we provide food, particularly to both conflict and climate affected communities, work in Syria, but also in addition to the conflict suffered through an earthquake. Haiti, which is obviously in the news a lot these days with the gang violence in Port-au-Prince, and what that has done in terms of market access and ability to access agricultural inputs, even in the rest of the country. So yeah, really quite tragic numbers, and huge numbers in terms of actual population in some of these countries as well. So 63% in South Sudan, 36% in Madagascar, represent a lot of people. And so when we look at what is driving these numbers, what has sort of led to that uptick that we're seeing in food insecurity around the world, really three drivers that we look at. First, and certainly foremost, is conflict and insecurity. And that has risen dramatically in the last decade, both sort of internal conflict, but also interstate conflict. When we look at places like Ukraine or Gaza, economic shocks has certainly been rising, even here in Canada. We just have to look at inflation and how that has impacted on purchasing power and really caused food insecurity issues here at home among our communities and neighbors. And another one that sort of we see rise and fall is weather extremes. And particularly in years where there is an El Nino, we often see those extreme weather events exaggerated even further. And so that can fluctuate a little bit over time, but yeah, also seeing a steady increase. So when we look at these three drivers, I sort of want to break them apart a little bit this afternoon and talk about what it means in terms of food insecurity. So first, when we look at climate, so sort of the weather events, and this is from the World Food Programme, working with the Met Office on looking at forecasting that at the current rate of global warming, and you'll see in the next slide, what countries are most impacted in terms of food security when we talk about climate change. And so the darker the red in the image here, the higher the vulnerability to food insecurity as a result of climate change. So you really see that band across sub-Saharan Africa, already many places in the present day, very much made vulnerable by climate change. And I think it's also interesting to note in South America, parts of Asia, these are often areas where there is robust agricultural systems, but can be very vulnerable to strong El Nino effects, droughts, weather shocks. So I'm going to flip ahead to a projection that I had generated on the website for 2050. So this assumes that we continue the high rate of emissions that we have and that adaptation is none. So I think it's the most pessimistic forecast for sure. There are efforts to adapt and to mitigate, but certainly not keeping pace. So in sort of the most pessimistic projection, in 2050, you have almost all of the continent of Africa being in that high vulnerability as a result of climate change. But you also, and I think most significantly, if you look at Central America, suddenly see countries like Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras experience extreme food insecurity. And even in my time, when I first started working in 2008 in this area, it wasn't common to see food interventions in Central America, whereas now it's increasingly common in areas, particularly in Honduras, in the dry corridor through Central America. So if I put these side by side, they're quite small, but just to give you a bit of an idea of where climate change is having the biggest impact in terms of food security. When we think about conflict, we just have to look at PWRDF's own programming portfolio to see the impact that conflict is having on food security. So in Haiti, we're working with a partner in the north of Haiti, and they have a program where they were looking at getting agricultural machinery that then got stuck in Port-au-Prince for many months. They couldn't get moved out and taken to the area where the program was taking place because of the gang violence. And so communities were harvesting without being able to process those harvests. In Ukraine, in addition to the food insecurity, and probably will recall when the conflict began, Ukraine is one of the big wheat producers in the world. And so that had a knock-on effect in countries where they would export. But in Ukraine, we have a focus this year looking at psychosocial care and particularly children. In South Sudan, I think Naba is on the call, a lot of programming happening there around both the conflict, but also the flooding and the El Nino that is being experienced in East Africa. And of course, Gaza can't be left off this list. I'm working with the Diocese of Jerusalem, the health center in Gaza, but also food insecurity, a huge challenge in Gaza. Finally, when we think about conflict, looking at displacement, and this also is a number that has been increasing in recent years. So in the last 3 years alone, this number of 90 million in the center, whether internally displaced or refugees, has risen by almost 10 million. And there are some estimates that we're now over 100 million people displaced around the world. So that is really changing the nature of programming, where we're working in places that you have large displaced populations, either internally or as refugees, trying to make new livelihoods, new lives for themselves in different areas. And then finally, I do want to mention the ongoing COVID pandemic, because as much as we want to believe it's over, the impacts of it continue to be felt and the ripples seen. And when I think about the pandemic, we talked a lot in the beginning, sort of this idea of it's a cascading crisis, that it started off, we saw the health crisis, then we saw, what that did in terms of livelihoods and economies, what that did in terms of, the places where there were already crises happening. So these crises within crises, that you have perhaps a refugee camp, and now there's a COVID outbreak within that. You had a place perhaps experiencing economic crisis, and now the health emergency on top of that. And those were sort of the visible things that we were responding to during COVID. But it's those invisible things that were happening at the same time in terms of how this changed household dynamics. We saw increases in gender-based violence and the impact on livelihoods. People perhaps not being able to plant because they couldn't get access to seeds in the market because of lockdowns. And so that sort of invisible piece. But I think the most significant is that sort of deep piece on systems, that the pandemic has really disrupted systems in a lot of places and has had a significant impact and a setback on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's been a lot of recalibrating, and in some ways on the sort of opportunity side, there's a chance to rethink some systems that are there that haven't been working. But there is a sense of instability in many of the systems that sort of guide markets, guide ways of working. Even here in Canada, how we work and how we gather has changed. When we think as well of the situation and the complexity, I think we also have to think about funding. And I want to think about funding in two sort of aspects here. First and foremost, the funding that we as an organization are fortunate to receive. But then I also want to talk a little bit about how cash programming is changing the way that we are working. So some really good news here, and this comes from a Cooperation Canada report that is issued every year. The new report should be coming out usually in the beginning of June, so this is 1 year old. But our official development assistance has increased every year since 2015 and 2016. So I think a real point of celebration. As nonprofit organizations, we like to complain a lot about government funding and the lack of it, or that it's not going to the right things. But I think it is important to also acknowledge when, there is a good news story here, and that is that our ODA has been increasing. A lot, obviously, has been related to the Ukraine conflict in the last 2 years. A lot of it has been through major loans in donor and refugee costs, so refugees coming to Canada. But again, the sort of headline is that it has increased. And the other bit of good news when it comes to Canadian funding is that there has been an increase in the humanitarian funding, and another increase announced in the recent budget. And that increase hasn't come at the cost of long-term development funding. So it's been an increase in both areas, a 36% increase in humanitarian assistance and a 23% increase in long-term development funding. And so good news on both fronts. And you can do, if this is something of interest, I certainly encourage you to have a look at the Cooperation Canada report and read the different ways in which Canadian funding is being used internationally. When we think about where Canadian dollars are going, I should have looked up HPDS before. It's someone on this call might know what it is. It's the humanitarian funding. But the top 5 countries where Canadian funding is going in 2021-22, so a little bit dated now, the report's always a year behind, is Ethiopia, Afghanistan. And again, I think a real point of celebration around Canadian funding in Afghanistan, because initially it wasn't possible for organizations like PWRDF to get funding to organizations working in Afghanistan because of the counterterrorism laws here in Canada. So it took a fairly large advocacy effort and public campaign to get that law changed so that funding can be moved to Afghanistan to meet the needs of vulnerable people. Bangladesh and DRC, and then Ukraine round out the top 5. And I would guess that's fairly consistent since then as well. Just sort of looking at other trends. And then a final one I want to mention when it comes to funding, because I think it's something we're seeing also at PWRDF, is that there is globally, so this is a global picture, an increase in private funding. So we often think of government when we think about funding, but in reality, the percentage of private funding has been increasing for the last number of years, whether that be from individuals or foundations, companies or corporations, but a huge sort of change in dynamics when funding perhaps has less restrictions attached to it, perhaps less political interest, or perhaps a whole lot more individual interest. There's certainly some interesting discussions about what philanthropy looks like in the future. And then sort of I want to flip that sort of funding conversation around and talk a little bit about how that changes in funding regulations and funders has changed how we can use that funding in some pretty significant ways. And one of the most significant ways has been the introduction of what's called multi-purpose cash. So multi-purpose cash globally in sort of the humanitarian work now, this takes into account the Red Crosses and the UN, is over 7.9 billion of funding is being dispersed as multi-purpose cash. So a massive number, and we are just a small part of it. But we have also moved into programming where we are dispersing assistance through the provision of cash, whether that's electronically, in cards, or sometimes in cash itself. Now, when we talk about cash, there's a lot of, concerns about how it's used. So I often like to go to this report that was released by the Food and Agriculture Organization a few years ago on a research that they did into how cash is used when people receive it. And so there was it was a myth-busting approach. And one of the myths around cash disbursements is that it'll be wasted on alcohol and tobacco. And they found that actually only 1 to 2% of the total was used on alcohol or tobacco, and no real evidence that that was an increase in expenditure when cash was added into the household budget. I also like to reflect on and fill up the chat if anyone wants to make a guess at what these pictures on the screen are, these 4 staples. Anyone's got their keyboard handy, but what do you recognize from left to right? You can name them off or unmute quickly.
Rice,
corn,
maize, yeah, I think.
grain,
Millet,
millet,
is that barley in the third one?
Close. So the last, you've got millet and then you've got sorghum. So from left to right, it was rice, maize, millet, and sorghum. What two things do these have in common? I won't put anyone on the spot for this, but the two things these have in common is these four staples represent the most common in-kind food that's provided to households in food distributions. And these are also, you can turn any of these staples into alcohol. So if you ferment them, you can make alcohol out of rice, maize, millet, or sorghum. And so for me, it's always, if people want alcohol, they will find a way to get alcohol, whether through cash or in-kind food. Another myth when it comes to the provision of cash is that it leads to inflation. That cash coming into the market can lead to price increases that impact the whole community. And so instead of actually making a situation better, you can make a situation worse. And again, in the same study across 6 countries, that wasn't found to be the case. And in my previous role, I did quite a bit of cash programming. And to me, I think it's always sort of important to reflect on some of the tools and methodologies that we use when working with partners on the design of programs. And so there's a tool called the Emergency Market Mapping Analysis, EMA. And within that, you're really looking at the markets in the area of the project intervention to make sure that these markets have integration to larger markets, that they're not sort of siloed in terms of the products that they're providing, but really that they're linked into a market network. You're looking at competitiveness, like you'll literally walk into a marketplace and how many people are selling rice? How many people are selling soap? How many people, is there enough competitiveness in the market that if one vendor raises their prices, everyone will go to the other vendors who are still selling at a lower price. You're looking at the overall risk of price increases or decreases during the project implementation period. If you're in a season of production where there isn't much food on the market, there is a risk that prices will increase throughout the project. So you might be starting by distributing, let's say, $50 a month to each household. And at the beginning of the project, $50 might buy you a 20 kg bag of rice. But because of the season of the project, by the end of the project, that $50 may only buy you a 10 kg of rice. So you're looking at what are the risks of market changes during the length of the project. And then finally, you're looking at the elasticity of the market. So if you disperse money on a Monday and everyone goes to the market on Tuesday, by Thursday, can the market be restocked? What is the ability of the market to absorb the additional purchases that are happening? So I'm going to stop there for a moment and take any questions that maybe have come up in this section. Stops.
Thanks, Jackie. There have been a couple that are in the chat. Janet Ellingham asks, what are the markers for defining undernourishment? And are they internationally consistent or country by country?
Yeah, so they are internationally consistent. So when you're looking at undernourishment, essentially you're looking at two things. You're looking at the overall caloric intake, and you're looking at the composition of those calories. How much of that is protein? How much of that is fats? How much of that is carbs? And you're looking for a balance. So if you're getting too few calories, or if you're getting too few fats and proteins, and you have a very carb-heavy diet that maybe is meeting the caloric intake, but you're not getting the mixture that you need of nutrients. When we talk about specific vulnerable populations like under 5, you have additional measures of malnourishment that are taken at the circumference of the upper arm. So you're looking for sort of some key metrics to be met there, and very much standardized and globally used.
Thank you. And Diane was in reference, I believe, to the maps that you were showing around food security and climate change, noticing that Canada is not evaluated in the present day vulnerability, and yet I'm sure that food insecurity must be multiplied up north particularly. Any comments on that?
Yeah, and I think again, this will, and I think the website for the map is there. You can opt some different countries into it, but a lot of the countries that are profiled on that map are reliant on their national agriculture production. And so in places like the United States, Canada, and much of Europe, the agriculture is impacted. But if we sort of look at the connectedness of the market will adjust by importing goods and food into the market. So it's a little bit of a different, how do you say, impact. That climate change would certainly impact prices here in Canada, but not necessarily the availability of food within the market. Whereas countries that are much more reliant on their own national production as opposed to import, there's sort of a direct causality that you can link there.
And yes, you did mention, I did type the website link into the chat for those who are interested in looking at some of the information that Jackie shared. Ken is asking about advocacy and wondering to what extent do you see PWRDF bringing analysis and advocacy seeking to challenge and change what many call business as usual behavior nationally and globally? And I was hearing you speak about the advocacy work that happened around getting aid into Afghanistan, for example, but there might be others to mention.
Yeah, I think there's quite a number of different ways and levels of advocacy. So for me, I'm often quite fascinated by the advocacy that happens through the availability of data. And so one thing that when we look at priority setting within different global systems, it often relies on data that comes from governments. And certain governments may not want to profile issues that are happening in some areas of the country that perhaps aren't affecting the majority population in that country. And so one thing that has been really interesting in the last few years is trying to have more of a grassroots picture emerge of what is food insecurity. And it's a process of gathering up data from organizations like many of our partners and what they're seeing in their communities. And so the sort of democratization of sorts of the data collection process, I think, is one way of bringing information to light that perhaps doesn't come through some of the government channels that we're more sort of accustomed to looking at. I think another sort of key piece on advocacy, and Suzanne and Kim have more to say on this, is the connections to a lot of our networks. You know, we recognize sort of where we can add voice to things. We don't need to be the voice on a particular issue, but certainly can amplify the voices of partners and what they're advocating for in their different contexts. And also that sort of reciprocal, that countries that are experiencing the impacts of climate change, as a country that is perhaps contributing more to climate change, what are our obligations as global solidarity to not only amplify their voice, but raise a specific voice here in Canada. I don't know, Kim and Suzanne, if you might have perhaps even more on that than I do.
Maybe just quickly to add that probably many are aware that we're, as Jackie mentioned, part of networks addressing a range of concerns. The Canadian Council for Refugees, where we are part of efforts around advocacy with and on behalf of refugees. Most recently was at a retreat of the For the Love of Creation, an ecumenical campaign working to address climate change through theology, through education, and through advocacy with the Canadian government and at the international level. So, and there are other examples, but I'll mention those two right now. And just one more, Jackie, before you move on. Chris was surprised by the myth-busting slide, and what he hears about more about is the concern that donations may be diverted by corruption. Any comments on that?
Sure. So, I mean, I made some editorial decision. The report has probably about 10 different myths in it, and for the interest of time, I just picked two that I found quite interesting. Indeed, the concern about funds being diverted is a common one, and I think one that we are particularly sensitive to as well. And within PWRDF, making sure that we're working with trusted partners, people that we know, and putting in place the systems and the checks and balances to ensure that funding is being used as it's intended to be, and also having ways of responding if there's concerns that perhaps isn't happening. So indeed, I think it is a very prevalent concern in all-out programming, but I think a lot of effort goes into making sure that we know who our partners are and that there is both the due diligence, but also the long-term relationship. So there can be good accountability built into the system.
Thank you. Let's move on. I'm seeing as time moves on, we need to move on.
Yeah. All right. So what I want to conclude with today is sort of that idea of looking ahead. And where are we going when we sort of look into the coming 5 years of programming. And so I want to sort of ground it in the emerging strategic plan within PWRDF. So a lot of work before I joined in discussions and conversations with stakeholders around what should our next strategic plan really focus on. And there are 7 priorities that have been identified for us as an organization. And I'm going to reflect on 3 of them. So the first priority I want to reflect on is looking at sustainable programs. How do we support sustainable programs and humanitarian assistance grounded in human rights and creation care? And various ways that sort of we've articulated that in terms of being able to deliver aid quickly and where it's needed most, empowering women and supporting families, looking at partners in mitigating the disproportional impacts of climate change that has been a theme throughout this presentation. And what I want to sort of highlight within this is something that we're talking about as a team in our programming, which is something called Nexus programming. And so Nexus programming is a little bit of technical jargon. It's not the thing that gets you across the border faster, but it's this idea of integrated programming, where you're looking at humanitarian needs, you're looking at development needs, and you're looking at peace, and you're looking at it simultaneously. That often in this work, we think of it as sort of a relay race, that you respond to the emergency, and then you transition into development assistance. And a little bit like relay runners, you pass the baton off and you wish them well and carry on. So sometimes it can be quite siloed, quite disconnected, and one doesn't build on the next. And also people don't experience their lives in technical jargon of relief and development agencies. So life is life. There isn't, these nice, neat sort of moments in time at a community level or a household level. So the idea of Nexus programming is, I like to say, it's basically multitasking. Can you as an organization respond to the humanitarian needs while also looking at long-term development needs and the peace needs? And if you can't as an organization, those aren't competencies and expertise that you bring, who can you bring alongside? What consortiums can you work in so that together you're looking at the whole picture and you're not, waiting for a humanitarian event to end before thinking about long-term development needs. And really the reason why this is needed goes back to the earlier portion of this presentation and how conflict is increasing. That when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the reason why they're increasingly unattainable is because in the areas that are experiencing chronic or protracted crises, development gains aren't being realized because the focus is on the humanitarian emergency. And I was at a conference last week and one of the presenters summed it up really well, and they said, you can't resolve a humanitarian crisis in a humanitarian response. That the underlying reason for the humanitarian emergency isn't going to be solved in a short-term intervention. You need to be thinking longer term. And so in this little diagram here, I like to think of it that as practitioners, we have a lot of tools at our disposal when it comes to early warning, when it comes to integrating disaster risk reduction or safety net programming, looking at adapting agricultural practices in places that are disaster prone, places where you might have a flood or you might have a drought, but it's predictable, it has a start and an end date. But we don't have many tools for the places where there's been a chronic or protracted emergency. So places like the Sahel, which have seen conflict for many years. And we need to develop as organizations ways of working and tools and ways of talking to each other, which is sort of what is being termed Nexus programming. So one of the things we're thinking of in the next 5 years is how do we engage in a more meaningful way in Nexus work? We've had some early experience in South Sudan. We were part of a consortium effort through the Canadian Food Grains Bank with Global Affairs Canada funding that allowed us to both respond to the humanitarian need and have what we call low regret strategies on development. So trying some longer term agricultural programming interventions that maybe won't succeed, and if they don't, that's okay. Versus, you failed in your analysis or you failed in your implementation because the results weren't there. So that's what's meant by this low regret strategies. And so we were one of the 9 members that were involved in South Sudan, and lots of really good learnings coming out of all that we're hoping to build on in the next strategic period. Another key priority, which is really a continuation of sort of the ethos of PWRDF, is that partners are at the center of our work, and that we place partners and their priorities at the very center. We know that they're the best equipped to identify priorities, that we support capacity sharing amongst partners, that we recognize their agency and their learning within their organizations. And how do we commit to a process of mutual collaboration, accountability, transparency, and trust? And one of the things that we're looking ahead to is how do we engage well when it comes to working with local organizations. There's lots of terminology around this. I pulled this from an organization called the Start Fund in the UK, where they look at 7 dimensions that when they talk about localization, working with local organizations, making real commitments to how much funding is going to local actors, how much participation commitments and visibility is being given to that work. And so I just pulled this one as an example of sort of how do we articulate what it is to live out that commitment of putting partners at the center of our work. And so one of the things we're looking at in the coming years is how do we articulate that as PWRDF so that organizations that are working with us can hold us accountable for behaviors and practices and targets that we've set around putting partners at the center of our work. We're hoping to have an opportunity in February to actually gather a number of our partners together to have dialogue and to talk through this together, as opposed to sort of working in our silo in Toronto and hoping we come up with a good solution. But certainly, how do we articulate this idea of where we work together, how we work together, and how we're held accountable for those practices? A third priority, which is really going to continue to shape the work of PWRDF programming in the coming 5 years, is our work in ecumenical networks. And we really, how do we sort of double down, continue to contribute to the vitality of ecumenical groups through the joint advocacy, through public engagement here in Canada? How do we contribute in meaningful ways staff and volunteer time to the functioning of these ecumenical groups, often stretched for funding, but providing vital places for us to gather as organizations? And also looking, how do we move beyond and look at interfaith engagement and collaboration? And so here I just want to highlight the Canadian Food Grains Bank, one of those ecumenical organizations that's quite critical to our work. And this year we have 4 projects and 1 potential program. So in South Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, existing or recently concluded projects. And then a possibility where a concept note was submitted in the Philippines. To me, I hope in 5 years' time, this map will have a number more circles on it and ways that we're able to grow our engagement through the Canadian Food Grains Bank. And so that's where I'm going to pause for today. And again, any questions on any of this or conversations, or happy to take them, or if my colleagues are on the line and want to jump in with any specifics, also certainly welcome that.
Thanks so much, Jackie. That's a very comprehensive presentation, lots of good information. And so, yes, let's open it up for questions and conversation. There aren't any new questions in the chat, but people are welcome to pop them in there, or there comes one, or to raise their hand. And a reminder again that the raise hand function is in React down at the bottom where there's a little heart. Deborah Penton asks, I'm wondering if Jackie will share her slideshow with us.
Suzanne will.
We'll get it to you for sure.
Actually, Kim will, but we will also be sharing the recording, so you didn't have to be madly writing.
Perfect, and that's good because my notes on this are just single words below each slide, so there's not too much in the notes section of this presentation.
And we probably should have said that at the beginning, because I noticed a few people taking notes like crazy, but never fear. And Ken just says a thank you for the presentation and for the well-managed tech, which we have gotten better at since the beginning of the pandemic. Any other questions or observations, comments?
I've just have a question.
Oh, Julie, thank you.
In the last, excuse me, in the last slide with the ecumenical and moving forward with ecumenical, are you looking at more collaboration, collaboration and sharing or with their programs? Or how are you foreseeing that in the future?
Are you referring, Julie, to development programs?
I'm looking at development program.
Right.
Yeah, so I think if I understand you right, Julie, within the context of CFGB, certainly there's space there to scale up the programming, both within our own partnerships, but also other members of CFGB who have programming around the world. Our ability to contribute to their work in different ways, both financially, but also through staff time. But I think it's also, again, I've sort of cherry-picked CFGB as just an example, but we do have other ecumenical networks that we're a part of, the ACT Alliance being one, the Anglican Alliance, Kairos here in Canada. So quite a variety of ways that we will be engaging in different ecumenical networks, and all with different opportunities. And certainly with the Anglican Alliance, increasing spaces for humanitarian response and humanitarian coordination among Anglican relief and development agencies around the world. So I think all of it is sort of both sort of scale and depth of programming, if put it that way.
And
Yeah.
I just to remind people of Jackie of your comments about the ACT Canada group and the work that's been done with other members of ACT in Eastern and Southern Africa, which we tend to think about I think about ACT as a humanitarian response mechanism, but development is also a part of the mandate, and that which has been a kind of a pilot, that effort hasn't it, is seeing possibilities for growth in development work ecumenically.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Deborah's asking, have we been able to increase our equity in CFGB?
We have, slowly and steadily. I think PWRDF was one of the last members to join CFGB, so you're one of the newer in the crowd, and that in terms of the question earlier about the change from World Renew to PWRDF. World Renew was one of the founding members of CFGB, so it's very deeply ingrained in the culture there. But it's good to see that also sort of growing within PWRDF. And so this year we increased our equity through fundraising by just under $100,000. And that does leverage into matched funding from Global Affairs Canada at the 4-to-1 and 3-to-1 rate. So there really is a really good return on investment when increases are made to equity. So I know colleagues in our fundraising team are certainly looking at ways that we can continue to raise the profile of the work through the Canadian Food Grains Bank. And we also benefit from equity from other members of CFGB. So it's not just what's in our account, but it's also generous contributions from the United Church and from the Presbyterians that have helped us scale up our work when we didn't have the funding in our own account. So a lot of sharing that happens within CFGB, not just what we fundraise, but also what others are able to fundraise and share.
Thanks. Marion has a question that I'm kind of wishing Sue McLeod, our youth engagement colleague, was with us for, but we'll see if someone wants to respond to it. Can you tell what the demographic contributions to PWRDF is? Are younger generations, though not attending church, contributing more?
I don't know. I'm happy to get back to you on that question. I think, yeah, I mean, there's certainly I think a range of demographics, and thinking beyond just sort of the financial contributions, but
Yeah.
also the way people contribute with prayer and with advocacy, with engagement.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different ways, and there's
And
been
with time,
really
yeah.
interesting ways to see youth engaging on issues of climate change and conflict in Gaza. So
Yeah. I'm not sure in terms of straight donations and fundraising that we're
Mm.
actually tracking age of our donors.
mm,
I mean, we've done surveys where we actually get them to self-disclose, and certainly our demographic skews high. But certainly we have young people who are donating their time, and I'd be curious to know also about in terms of financial, but Jackie's really right in saying that there's so many ways to get involved and engage, and advocacy tends to be, or even sharing and educating is a bigger one
Yeah.
for younger people.
Yeah,
Thank you
that's
so much, Jacqueline, for this amazing presentation. You know, globally, you made us aware the work, and also it's positive, you know, the outlook for the next 5 years. And everywhere we go, it's always negative. And here is somebody really telling us that it's going to be, you know, up to people on the ground level to embrace this and do, you know, whatever one can. And it will impact globally for every country that you mentioned. It's amazing. And I think mobilizing women, I think, is the strength of PWRDF, I think, because with women mobilized, the world will change. And thank you for that, you know, bringing forth that very strongly. And I like all the areas that you mentioned, the growth and also myth busting. You know, all these things are in our mind, but there's no reference to it thus far. And I think you made it all very clear. And this program that is can be distributed to everybody for their own you know, information. And a lot of people donate money, but they don't have feedback, like what's happening with it and how the whole thing is functioning. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks, Shireen. And I think indeed, even for myself, sometimes you can get a little lost in the headlines around the world and the tragedy we see. And for me, that's why I include people like Mercy, because I think it's so important to remember what it is when lives are transformed and how that transforms community and places. And that doesn't make the headline news, but it is important to constantly be reminded that those stories are there too.
Yeah.
And we are transformed by the information. And thanks for that.
Thanks, Shireen. And Jeff asked a comment about, do you get to visit the projects? Yeah,
Yeah. And do I have room in my suitcase? I try and travel light, Jeff. I'm not very good at it, so sometimes I do have a big suitcase. I am privileged enough that I do get to visit projects, and was fortunate enough to come on board at a time when there were a few partner events happening. So I've had the chance to get to Zimbabwe and meet with our partner, who was being visited by the Canadian ambassador in Zimbabwe. So I spent a few days with our Canadian ambassador, who was also very impressed with the work and has become a big advocate for how do we scale this up. And then I also had the chance to stop in Kenya at a transfer point on the way home and meet with our 6 partners there. And then went back to Ethiopia for a gathering of 18 organizations that are all part of that Nature Plus program, and hear stories of their work in Ethiopia and Kenya and share learnings across the network. So I have been spoiled in my first 5 months to get a chance to meet face to face with a number of partners in East and Southern Africa. So yeah, it's a real privilege, and it really does help energize and inform the work, and that constant reminder of, yeah, sometimes you're behind your computer working on proposals and templates, but at the end of the day, that does result in change at a community level.
And we're looking forward to having actually 2 partners from Zero Trust in Zimbabwe join us for our national gathering this coming fall. And Jackie mentioned meeting the ambassador, which has facilitated visas, which is a continuing challenge as we try to bring partners to meet with Canadian Anglicans. So grateful that that has moved forward, and we're looking forward to having them with us in the fall. I'm just checking. Oh, is the myth busting info on the PWRDF website? It is not, as far as I know. It comes from another source, I believe, Jackie, is that right? But is in your presentation that we'll send out.
Yeah, the link is there.
Might be a story idea to put forward to Janice.
That's true. We can,
And
I think,
Jacqueline.
yes, we have a Jacqueline Tingle joining us, who's our new communications associate, I believe.
Officer.
Officer. Thank you, Jacqueline. So take a note, Jacqueline. about
There's a lot
that.
of us.
And Jeff asks about a connection with twinned parishes around the world. I'm not sure.
Oh, you mean those what do you the relationship I'm having trouble with word finding where one companion dioceses, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, we're twinned. Sorry guys, I'm Jeff. We're twinned with Mumbai, is that right? I think. No, that's not right. Mumbai is in India.
Yeah.
Moamba. Is that how you pronounce it? And I just wondered if there's a link with PWRDF and our activities. That's all.
Is that
I
Tanzania?
think so.
No. Oh, crikey. You think I know that?
I know Mwandi and I know Mwanza, so.
That's a synod question. Let me see if I can find what we believe.
Yeah.
Mumbai is in India.
Yeah. So Jeff, when you find the right country or the right place, get back and we'll answer the question. But probably not, but who knows?
Victor asks, given that cash is becoming a more prominent mechanism for support, can you say a bit more about the distribution mechanism at the local level? Who disperses and how is it decided who receives it?
Sure. So let me start with the first part. And I mean, certainly Naba, I think if he's on the call, can speak a little bit to how it was dispersed in South Sudan specifically. But in terms of disbursement, it will depend where and what's available in the country. So a lot is done through phone transfers. So you have a lot of electronic cash in places like Kenya where they use M-Pesa, where it's possible just to disperse cash to phones that are then used at local kiosks or can be sort of withdrawn in cash from those kiosks. In some places, it's the distribution of almost like a plastic card, a credit card of sorts, that is preloaded either for specific shops, so perhaps grocery stores, or just available at any vendor. And then, in some places where it's quite remote and actual cash is the only possibility, you can actually have armored cars with cash coming to be distributed. So it is the range, and it's again taking into account the safety of people who are receiving the money, but also how they utilize money. There's no point in dispersing cash in e-transfers if there are no vendors who accept that. In terms of who disperses and how, again, a lot of the disbursement will be done through companies that specialize in this so that the risk is absorbed by them and that there isn't risk to partner staff who might be moving around with large sums of money on their persons. We don't want that. And who is deciding? A lot of time it will be local committees that are formed, and there's a vulnerability criteria that is set as part of the project design, looking at, in places where there perhaps is widespread hunger and the project can't address them all, how are we making sure we're targeting the most vulnerable? And that often is the elderly, female-headed households, large families, people living with disabilities. So it's usually a criteria that is generated together to make sure that indeed we're meeting the objectives of the funding and the project, but also the unique context is being taken into account. And there can be places where on the surface, for example, I was involved in a project in my former role in Kenya where there had been a flood. And so sort of the logical thinking was, well, we've got to go and target farmers. They're the ones that have been affected by the flood. But when the conversations began at the community level as well, actually, yes, but we also have to ask the question, who has family members working in the tourist areas that are able to send funding back to their families? So they have access to resources that it's not visible on the surface, but that's again where the communities and the committees that are formed can bring that context in. And we had a cash program in South Sudan. So I don't know, Naba, if you want to say anything on that, if you're still on the call. I can't see all the names here. Not to put you on the spot, you can just disappear if you don't want to answer that, but
Yes, Jackie, thank you for the question. Yes, various mechanisms, of course, depending on the local context. And in some contexts, as Jackie said, in rural Fangag in South Sudan, distributing hard cash was the only option. Of course, the preferred option would be bank deposit or e-transfer to their cell phones. But when people don't have cell phones or bank, uh, assisting them with bank accounts would be too cumbersome, or they were too far away from the bank branches. I think hard cash is the only option, and so yeah. So again, sitting with the local committees, looking for all the options, including non-cash options, in-kind options, and then consulting with them, and they would decide which is the best way to go. If the market is functioning, market is accessible for women and for people with disability as well, and if they're so if hard cash is the only or the best option available there, and that's the way to choose. So depending on the context, in some cases in Kenya, we've done in-kind food transfer. In South Sudan, in Ye, for the returnees, those who were returning from Uganda, refugee camps in Uganda, they were provided with cash, and also in Fangag. So yeah, but different modalities depending on different contexts and different way mechanisms of transfer. Thank you.
thanks, Naba.
Thanks, Neba and Jackie. I see we're coming to the end of time. Jeff has put in the chat that Edmonton is twinned with Bouye in Burundi. I am aware that we've had programming with the Diocese of Bouye in the past. I'm not sure that we do now. I don't know if one of the, if Jackie, you're aware of that, or if someone on the team would be able to just say something quickly about that.
Just reading our report, but Andrea would know. She's still on the call. I don't think we have any current programming in Burundi, but perhaps Andrea, if you're around.
Yeah, we have worked with Bouye in the past, but we don't currently have any projects with them. I believe we had a lot on food security, if I'm remembering correctly.
Andrea.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we're going to stop there. We're almost at an hour and a half, and I think Jackie's kind of talked out. I know I would be after an hour and a half. And so a big thank you to Jackie, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We'd like to end with prayer, and I am going to try to share my screen and invite you to remain on mute, but to share this closing prayer with me. So let me try to bring that up. This is comes in the form of a statement of faith, which I think it's always good to remind ourselves what we're about as we talk about programming in complex times and the work that we do. So let us pray, and I invite you to pray this with me. We believe in the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who journeys with us through life and leads us to new beginnings. We believe in the God of Moses, who frees us from oppression and guides us through desert, wilderness, and sin to the promised land. We believe in the God of the prophets, who asks for justice in our land and cares for the poor. We believe in Jesus Christ, who brought the gospel to us, who celebrated God's unconditional love for everyone. And we believe in the Holy Spirit, who forms and molds us into God's image, who sends us out to serve God and people, who leads us to everlasting life. Amen.